The Honourable for Elmwood Transcona.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I want to start just by saying a big thank you to the member for Nanaimo-Ladysmith. Electoral reform is an important issue in Canada, and it's important that we keep it an issue on Parliament Hill. And by choosing to move ahead with this motion, the member for Nanaimo-Ladysmith has caused us to be talking about it on the floor of the House and brought it to the attention of all members. That's something I think the Prime Minister was hoping wouldn't happen after he crassly broke his promise after throwing out a great set of recommendations by a special committee on parliamentary reform that was set up, notwithstanding the fact that it was a majority government at that time. It was set up on a proportional basis, and opposition parties at that time came together in a way that I think the government frankly didn't expect, and did find a path forward for electoral reform, one that the government quickly threw in the bin. And so I don't want to repeat all of the arguments that I've made elsewhere on the record and that the member for Nanaimo-Ladysmith eloquently made today about the nature of representation in Parliament, which is surely a very important argument, and she presented some facts and figures about the ways in which Canada is not adequately represented, whether it's women or different racial minorities in Canada. People living with disabilities are not adequately represented in the chamber. She also talked about some of the disillusionment with politics that's occurring and a sense by people that their vote doesn't really count, or that they have to vote against what they don't want instead of voting for what they do want. And those are all themes that, as people who knock on doors and talk to people about political engagement, we're very aware of. It's not a limited phenomenon in Canada. It's why voter engagement, it's one of the reasons that voter engagement is going down in Canada instead of up, as people feel more and more alienated from the system. And surely the Prime Minister breaking what was a very clear promise in the 2015 election was an important moment for many Canadians, and unfortunately not a positive one. It wasn't one that drew people to politics. It wasn't one that caused people to feel that when politicians make promises and they rally behind them, that there's a positive outcome or the promised outcome on the other end of that. And that's why I think it is important now to put the emphasis on a citizens' assembly, because there is a fair amount of broken trust, a trust that the Prime Minister himself is responsible for having broken. Not just once, though, not just after the 2015 election and the subsequent report by the special committee and the crass kind of dismissal of that report, but he did it again recently after Liberal Party members passed a resolution at their own convention calling for an examination of the electoral process and a move away from the first past the post system. And the Prime Minister came out the very next day. The convention wasn't even over, and he was already talking about how that wouldn't proceed. There's no consensus. Well, I mean, it's very easy to stand up and say there's no consensus when you're the person that's getting in the way of there being a consensus. But opposition parties in the 42nd Parliament showed that even between parties as disparate and who disagree even on the matter of electoral reform, to the extent that Conservatives and the Bloc and New Democrats and Greens sometimes do disagree on these matters, and if we each got to pick our ideal system, it probably wouldn't be the same system. We nevertheless worked together to form a majority consensus on that committee. So I think opposition parties in Canada showed very clearly that where there's a will, there's a way. The person who's been standing in the way of that consensus, the only reason why there isn't a consensus on how to move forward, is because the Prime Minister has refused to accept the consensus that other parties have shown they're able to come to in order to move forward on this most important issue. And why is it that the Prime Minister says there should be no consensus? Why is it that he doesn't agree? Because he says proportional representation is divisive. Well, Madam Speaker, let's take a look at what the first past the post system has created in this place. Is it a place of unity? Is it a place of respectful discourse? No, it's a place of incredible division, where we're routinely saturated with misrepresentations. Like, for instance, that there's an NDP Liberal coalition. There's a supply and confidence agreement. That's true. It's published online. Anyone who wants the details of that can go online. It's a fully transparent document. We've shown time and time again, whether it's on a public inquiry on foreign interference or just recently on the Conservatives' own carbon tax motion, that we're prepared to disagree with this government and not support them on important issues of the day. Why? Because we aren't the government. We aren't a part of that government. We are willing to work with the government on issues like dental care, like increasing funding for housing, and a number of other things that are in the supply and confidence agreement that Canadians right now who are watching can Google and read it online. That much is true. Do the Conservatives say in French that there's an NDP Liberal coalition? Not anymore, because it doesn't suit their political interests. Instead, they say there's a Liberal Bloc coalition. Alors, on ne sait pas. Si on parle anglais, c'est une coalition du NPD et les libéraux. Mais si on parle en français, c'est une coalition du Bloc et les libéraux. Ben, c'est lequel? Parce que ça doit être un ou l'autre si on parle d'un gouvernement uni ou qui fait partie de deux partis politiques. But the truth is, it's neither. The Bloc aren't in a coalition with the government, and we're not in a coalition with the government. We just voted with the Conservatives again on an important issue of the day, expanding the pause on the carbon tax to avoid regional division within the carbon pricing system. Is that a Conservative NDP coalition? No, I suppose we could call it that, though. So there's a Liberal NDP coalition, there's a Conservative NDP coalition, there's a Bloc Liberal coalition. I've seen the Bloc vote with the Conservatives. Surely that's a coalition, Madam Speaker. I guess there's a Conservative Bloc coalition. I watched on an important matter of democracy, which had to do with abuses of confidence and prorogation in this House. Liberals and Conservatives stand up together to maintain the power of the Prime Minister to shut this place down. That was a Liberal-Conservative coalition, I guess, Madam Speaker. We'll just call it a coalition anytime parties that happen to agree on any issue. When I voted with the Conservatives to disallow the wage subsidy to companies that were paying dividends on Bill C-2 in this Parliament, perhaps that was a coalition. When I worked with the member for Sarnia-Lambton on important pension reform, the Bloc were part of that too. I suppose that was a coalition. So who's running the country? It depends, I guess, what vote you decide you're going to use to evaluate who's running the country. My point in all this, Madam Speaker, is that the first past the post system sure as heck hasn't created a more unified body politic. It hasn't stopped division. In fact, it's encouraged it, because this dishonest portrayal of the confidence and supply agreement between the NDP and the Liberals is motivated, or sometimes the Bloc and the Liberals. As I say, if you're speaking in French, it depends on the day. The Conservative leader, of course, is not who he says he is. He's one guy in French, he's another guy in English. And never mind, there's other examples. I won't go on, because I want to bring it back to the motion. And the fact of the matter is they're misrepresenting the truth on any day of the week because they're chasing 40% of the vote. Because we have an electoral system in this country that means you can fight tooth and nail not to win the hearts and minds of a majority of Canadians, but just get 40 or even 39% of the votes of the Canadians who, despite being disgusted with the state of political discourse, still show up to vote. And if you can get 39% of those, and if you can use dishonesty and other misrepresentations to drive well-meaning Canadians away from polling stations, you can get 100% of the power with just 39% of the vote. And the culprit in all of this is the Prime Minister, who refuses to accept that our voting system encourages division.
Yes.
And it's simply untrue to say that a proportional system would sow more division and discontent than we see in our current system. You couldn't pack more into an electoral system in terms of division and nasty politics than we're seeing in Canadian politics today. And yes, the Conservative leader is responsible for his fair share of that, but one of the things we could do structurally in order to encourage better behavior and more collaboration between parties, despite the fact they disagree, and I'm proud of the fact that New Democrats have been modeling, both with Liberals and Conservatives, depending on the issue, collaboration. We want a system that encourages that rather than encouraging the opposite. And so I think we've got a lot of evidence to say that preserving the current voting system is not standing up against divisive, nasty politics. In Canada today, it's precisely the opposite, which is why we should support the motion from the member from Nanaimo-Ladysmith.
Hear, hear.